It seems to me, first of all, from what I understand from doctors, that's really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
And when it comes to establishing your worldview, I was curious, what newspapers and magazines did you regularly read before you were tapped for this to stay informed and to understand the world?
I've read most of them, again, with a great appreciation for the press, for the media.
But like what ones specifically, I'm curious that you...
all of them, any of them that have...
Can demonic spirits attach themselves to inanimate objects? The answer is yes.
Welcome to Twatwaffle of the Week. As per usual, I have an overabundance of stories for this past week's Twatwaffle of the Week episode. Being that there were so many, some of the stories are being neglected or glossed over. The ramifications being ignored or in some cases not even known. The following are some stories that I think people should be aware of for various reasons, mostly overshadowed by Trump and his antics. First up,
reversing decades of interpretation. Court expands LGBT worker rights by attacking originalism.
Quote, in their groundbreaking decision, 9 of 12 judges in an en banc panel of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals said that gay and lesbian workers are protected under Title VII. The Hively v. Ivy Tech Community College decision marks a major break from an interpretation that excluded sexual orientation, except in instances where one could make an argument of gender nonconformity. That meant that, previously, in order for workers to prove discrimination under Title VII, they had to allege that they were being discriminated against because they were not acting according to the stereotype associated with their gender. Further along, Salon's article cites the one paragraph, discrimination charge that Hively filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It simply stated, quote, I've applied for several positions at Ivy Tech, full-time, in the last 5 years. I believe I am being blocked from full-time employment without just cause. I believe I am being discriminated against based on my sexual orientation. I believe I have been discriminated against, that my rights under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were violated. End quote. So basically, what it boils down to, discrimination based on sexual orientation is indeed a form of sex discrimination prohibited under Title VII. According to Chief Judge Diane Wood, quote, the logic of the Supreme Court's decision, as well as the common sense reality that it is actually impossible to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation without discriminating on the basis of sex, persuades us that the time has come to overrule our previous cases that have endeavored to find and observe that line. End quote. So, for shits and giggles, this is Ken Ham's response to the ruling. Quote, how will this affect religious nonprofits and for-profits? We don't know yet, but it's a sign that the religious beliefs of Christians and others are not likely to be protected. This ruling follows in the trend of many other state laws that equate sex and sexual orientation and that refuse to recognize this as a moral, not a civil rights issue. This is of grave concern. End quote. Well, Ken, I hate to rain on your parade, but who I fuck has no bearing on my morals. I do not need an externally derived divine plan to determine the meaning of life. It is internal, affected only by myself. In other words, I bang my own drum. By this I do not mean in a hedonistic kind of way, as there are forces outside myself that influence my thoughts. Some subtly, others not so much. But I control my destiny. I control what is meaningful in my life. Do we really need a deity to tell us that a life of altruism and compassion is more worthwhile than a life spent creating injustice in the world? Second, and just a little FYI, The holiness code, described in Leviticus 18 and 20, are not part of the moral code. As hard as modern-day anti-gay apologists such as yourself try to force it into that pigeonhole, you're wrong. The passage deals with ritual uncleanliness, to'ibah, and the separation of the Jews and Gentiles in the Old Testament. It's a point made abundantly clear in chapter 20, verses 22 through 26 of Leviticus. But you wouldn't be aware of that, as reading the Bible is a foreign concept. Cherry-picking is more your style, and just like many others of your ilk, you cannot support a one-verse theology. What would the news be without a Trump besides freak-free? Maybe honest. Or having a fucking clue what Daddy-O is doing. Ivanka Trump tweeted this past week, quote,
This, Pound National Library Week, we honor our libraries and librarians for opening our eyes to the world of knowledge, learning, and reading.
End quote. Now keep that in mind. According to The Hill, as National Library Week begins April 9th, the Trump administration and Republican Party have launched an unprecedented attack on the institution by submitting a zero-budget request for the Institute for Library and Museum Services. ILMS Director Dr. Catherine Matthew notes that $214 million of the $230 million budget goes directly to grants to states and local libraries, including $155 million distributed through a population-based formula grant. Zero budget request, but she's praising the libraries. Yeah. Now, as many of you know, or have figured out, I'm kind of a bookish nerd. I grew up long before the internet, and I lived for my local libraries. Hell, I lived in my libraries. Living in Western New York, I had many to choose from. While my choice now is limited to just one, currently, I happen to live right next door to our local branch. It's no bigger than a branch library in Western New York, and I think this library has much to be proud of and is an excellent source of local history and has a wonderful staff. I know quite a few that utilize the various services. Therefore, I find the unwillingness to fund the Institute for Library and Museum Services very distressing. As Templeton writes, libraries are essential to society and, particularly, to democracies. There is a consistent budgetary theme against information and creativity. It is clear that there is a political motive to suppress transparency. One of the most important functions of libraries is to provide citizens with the information necessary to make decisions as interveners or voters. Since the administration and Congress are also threatening the right to vote, libraries are a threat to their aims. Further on, boosting library funding would make our communities safer and smarter. That explains why they're under attack. End quote. These next two reports are a bit distressing, especially this one concerning Briarwood Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, Alabama.
Alabama Senate votes to let church create its own police force.
Quote, the Alabama State Senate passed a bill on Tuesday that will allow an individual church to create its own police force to patrol their property and schools, stirring controversy about private law enforcement units for houses of worship. According to the Associated Press, the bill passed the Senate in a 24-4 vote to grant Briarwood Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, Alabama, the right to create its own police staff. Officers would be restricted to church property, but still invested with all the powers of law enforcement officers in Alabama, according to the text of the bill. Further on, after the shooting at Sandy Hook and in the wake of similar assaults at churches and schools, Briarwood recognized the need to provide qualified first responders to coordinate with local law enforcement who so heroically and effectively serve their communities. The statement reads, Code 1622-1 of Alabama law provides for the employment of one or more persons to act as police officers at colleges and other private educational institutions. The Church seeks to mirror that provision in a special law to be presented to the Alabama legislature. End quote. As Think Progress notes, besides the obvious SOCUS violation, quote, religious groups have sometimes used loopholes and lack of oversight to obscure issues of abuse. Yet the Alabama Department of Human Resources has no power to investigate due to religious exemptions. End quote. Adding to that, Reverb highlights, quote, it also singles out one particular church out of the thousands of churches, synagogues, mosques, and other religious entities in Alabama that may have other concerns, thereby favoring one specific religious group. End quote. The second story is a bit difficult to highlight the newsworthy issue at hand without delving into the rabbit hole the subject brings about. As with religious proselytizing, in my opinion, I find the need to flyer the neighborhood completely asinine. If your message is so keen, it should advertise itself. But alas, that's not the case.
White nationalists are now recruiting at college campuses.
Quote, since last September, 120 cases of white supremacist flyers, posters, or stickers have been reported on American college campuses, according to a recent study from the Anti-Defamation League. These white supremacist groups feel that now is the time to strike, says Orrin Siegel, director of the ADL's Center for Extremism. They feel like their messages have been mainstreamed. They feel like there's an opening for them now in a way that they haven't really felt before. Further on, true, the number of incidents nationwide might be relatively small, according to the ADL. There have been 121 instances of white nationalist campus flyering since the current school year began last fall, and there remain plenty of questions too about the true size and scope of the efforts. But the sheer volume of college campuses that have been hit with flyers, says Ryan Lentz, spokesman for the Alabama-based Southern Poverty Law Center, points to a very concerted effort on the part of the radical right to view college campuses as a recruiting ground. End quote. For colleges and universities, the vast majority of which hold themselves out to be bastions of free speech, navigating the recent increase in racist propaganda has been a very tricky endeavor at best. An issue that really has no easy answer without jeopardizing the notion behind free speech. But free speech does not imply free platform. I know there's more to the issue, and I'm really oversimplifying for brevity, so don't shoot the messenger, please. As I said, I wanted to highlight just the need for flying, not the issue surrounding free speech, as that's a huge one. So I kind of ended there with a bit of a lurch due to my trip to ReasonCon 3 this past weekend. But I do have one more story that I want to add on, though it's not quite a Twatwaffle moment. I thought it was, but after further reading, I'm not quite so sure. It's more hyperbole than anything else, but it's a good demonstration that news sources do have an agenda.
Trump has not created 600,000 jobs since becoming president.
Now, it's by Connor Gaffey, and it's from Newsweek, and it's by Yahoo. And what I find funny about this story is that I will readily admit that I headline shop, but I do read the stories. as well as any cited sources within the story. So I'm not just basing my judgment on the headline. You know, I'm well aware that headlines, for the most part, are clickbait. In some degree, I think this story is a prime example. Here's what caught my eye, and why I think it's kind of sort of twat. Gephi, or Newsweek, as many authors don't get a say in how an article is titled, make it appear that Trump has been a failure in job creation. The actuality, though, is stated in the article. Quote, so far in 2017, the U.S. economy has added an average of 178,000 jobs per month, slightly lower than the 2016 average of 187,000 under the Obama administration. So really, Trump's not too far off of Obama's pace. While I personally would like to see better, I can accept that since, we accepted Obama's numbers as kind of a benchmark. But where the article headline can get away with hyperbole a bit, it goes on, and Trump is currently some way short of his promise to create 25 million jobs in the next decade, or 208,333 per month. Now, the point I'm trying to make, well, I dislike President Trump and his administration and all that goes with it. Politicians, by nature, are prone to make some outlandish claims and promises. I don't think this one fits. It does, but it doesn't. What's really odd is that I have yet to find a similar story focusing on these numbers. Now, it's been a week since this story came out, and a not so thorough search of my news feeds hasn't produced any other articles similar. So, take it as you may. So that does it for this episode. I do have a few doozies coming forth for the next installment, as well as a What Dune Reads segment, as I just finished A Plot Against America by Philip Roth. And I haven't done one of those segments in a long time. And just an FYI, Beyond the Trailer Park will be back next week live, and our guest will be Chris Serrata, and I highly recommend you listen to this episode. So take care, y'all.